Stories, fables, ghostly tales.
Welcome, listeners, to your Friday episode. I'm your host, the Tale Teller, and as always, Fridays are reserved for tales of the creepy, different, and/or unique. Our first tale sees lights underwater and a mysterious fog that really gets into the mind of its host. Our second tale accounts the journey of a special and unique entity, a little bit like you, listener, and how they progress through life. And our last tale was written in 1926 about another fog, a fog of a different kind and from a different world. Listeners, I hope you enjoy today's tales, and should you have any spare time, swing on by my Patreon, www.patreon.com/SFGT, where you can support the show there. Now turn off the lights, turn up the sound, and listen to something different. Enjoy. Fog. If you are reading this, then I am dead. And you are standing aboard a derelict Cyclone-class patrol ship, the USS Mistral, with her engines dead and her electrical systems non-functional. I was, the XO of this vessel, Lieutenant Commander Ryan Simmons. Please read this carefully. If you are an officer or enlisted man in the United States Navy, this is an order. Scuttle this vessel immediately. Do not finish this letter. Get off the Mistral at once and send her down. Consider this a quarantine scenario. All hands are likely dead. God help you if they're not. We are 8 days out of Kirkwall, tracking an intermittent and scrambled distress call from what appeared to be an Icelandic fishing vessel, the Magnusdóttir, deep in the no-fishing zone of the North Sea. We found the vessel, or rather, we found a mile-wide streak of oil and fragments, the largest of them still burning. The night before, the enlisted man on watch had reported seeing a flash of light on the horizon. The Magnusdóttir's crew was nowhere to be found, except for one lone fisherman. Unburned and floating at the far end of the debris field, he had been shot in the forehead with a small caliber revolver. When we fished his pale blue corpse from the frigid water, he was still clutching a fishing knife in one clamped hand. What we were able to piece together from the fragmented and confounded evidence was that, for reasons unknown, the crew had been in conflict, resulting in the murder of at least one sailor and the eventual sabotage and destruction of the ship. Visibility was only a few hundred feet as we spent the next day drifting silently among the debris, in hopes of finding a survivor. The crew was already visibly shaken by the discovery, the grim dread of the fog, and lone smoldering pieces of the Magnusdóttir that collided with our hull unsettled even the most seasoned of us. We had expected an easy cruise and the simple retrieval of a dozen thankful Icelandic fishermen. What we got, at first, was a silent and oil-slick-coated sea, a single corpse, and more than a few nagging questions. The Mistral had just been serviced after an extended tour with the Atlantic Fleet in Bahrain, before her transfer to the North Sea. She was in good running order, so I can only assume that the initial mechanical failure was an act of sabotage or of some external force. It happened the first night when our final sweep had been completed, and we returned to the site of the Magnusdóttir's first transmission. There was nothing initially remarkable about the spot. A cold and lonely set of coordinates and little else. I was in my cabin, just settling down when the call sounded from the captain, offering little information, just a stern order to meet him on deck. Dressing quickly, I emerged from my cabin into a cloud of palpable unease and fear. The enlisted men and the junior officers were coursing through the ship towards the deck like panicked rats. No one made eye contact or spoke. There was none of the usual gallows humor or camaraderie that bubbles up in situations of limited information, just a grim inertia that pulled us out into the Arctic night. On deck, the night was unnaturally clear and cold, and the bright of the stars burned in the frosty air. Around us in every direction, just a few hundred yards away, the fog and clouds whirled, as if held at bay by our presence. The captain was at the railing, leaning over along with the men on watch. I approached him, suddenly desperate and panicked to know what was happening, when I saw it, the light flooding up from beneath us. The sea was flat, like the surface of a mirror. The water was black, reflecting the pale pinpricks of the stars. But beneath the surface, something glowed with a cold light. Pulsating shapes of violet, green, and deep cobalt blue shone from beneath. They flowed and merged and shimmered silently, deep below the glassy sea. We stared, 24 men and women, struck dumb and horrified by the sight. There was a sense of scale that emerged from the fluid movement of the lights. They seemed to be many fathoms beneath us, which would make them terribly large and impossibly fast. There were no solid shapes, and no disturbance of the water, just a deep field of liquid, flowing light. We watched for what seemed like hours, entranced by the mesmerizing ballet of cold light, a mirror reflection of northern lights, when it ended abruptly. There were 3 almost simultaneous events. First, the lights seemed to contract, each mote freezing in place and collapsing like the iris of an eye in bright sunlight. Secondly, there was a tremor in the air that first raised the hair on the back of my neck. As the ghostly lights winked out of existence, it rose in intensity, until I thought my eyeballs might shake their way out of my head. Through the fog of sudden pain, I heard a noise rising above Arctic wind, a humming vibration from the Mistral herself, that matched the electric shuddering in my skull. It was as if every light bulb aboard the Mistral was suddenly flushed with power, flaring bright and buzzing noisily in their housings, and when the wine had reached a fever pitch, they began to pop and shatter among a shattering of sparks. From start to finish, it lasted less than 2 seconds, and we were left floating silently in the dark waters, beneath the starry sky on a dead and crippled boat. The damage was invisible without any obvious cause, and total. Nothing aboard the Mistral worked. Each carefully crafted system of multiple redundancies had crumbled. Every light was shattered, and even the replacement bulbs and the small flashlights we all carried held fused and useless filaments. Satellite phones, shortwave radios, all means of communication were useless bricks of plastic and wire. Every battery was dead. Every stereo system was silent. We were adrift, without sail or engine, isolated from the world by 100 miles of black and silent sea. The crew moved through the ship that first night like moles, fumbling through dark corridors with only a few pale green chemical lights to check each system. They relayed each disheartening message like a fire brigade through the darkness, to where the captain and I stood on the deck, trying to make sense of the senseless. At last, when nothing else could be done, I fumbled my way back to my cabin and tried to sleep, the darkness feeling like an oppressive, many-fingered hand, slowly gripping my chest. The next morning, I again took stock of our situation, hoping for some fragment of hope we had passed by in the night. The damage was total. We would have to find a way to send a distress call and hope that we had not drifted too far from our last known coordinates. The men may not have known the full details, but it was clear from their haunted visages that they knew how dire the situation was. The first death was that afternoon. The sounds of screaming brought me above deck and into a thick, heavy fog. High in the gloom, I could see bright, burning specks of light descending slowly. My stomach turned. It was 2 signal flares drifting uselessly through the haze. Some damn fool had fired the signal flares. I burned with an unfamiliar and foreign rage and rushed through the fog to the foredeck with hatred in my blood and my fists clamped tight. The scene that emerged from the fog broke me from my stupor. The enlisted man, a flare gun still in his hand, lay broken in a pool of blood. The captain stood over him, clutching the rail, driving the heel of his boot repeatedly into the broken mess of the boy's skull. I realized that the screaming I heard, the high, keening wail, was coming from the captain, his face in a rictus of animal rage. Around them was a small crowd standing motionless and silent, watching like sentinels. The captain turned to see me and dropped into a crouch, his fingers wrapping around the flare gun, and he raised it level with my eyes. We stared for a long moment at each other, our eyes locked as he panted heavily, his face lightly spattered with blood. The only sound was the wet, gurgling exhale of the enlisted man's death rattle, a bubble of blood forming on his ruined face. I had served with this man for nearly a decade. This was not the man I knew. This was a hollow simulacrum filled with violence and terror. I spoke to him then, in a soothing voice. I asked him to hand me the flare gun. He said nothing at first and then spoke, his voice a tiny trembling sound that was swallowed up by the thick gloom around us. "He murdered us, Brian. The fog, the flares will never..." He shook his head and clenched his eyes tight, as if he were trying to shake himself from a dream. Then he shuddered once, violently, his back arcing like a seizure. "This little fuck has killed us," he choked out. The flare gun wavered in the air, and I took a step closer, reaching out for him. He opened his eyes, and I froze again as we stared silently at one another. "You're going to die here," he giggled quietly. "I always wanted to watch you die, you fucking coward." He tilted his head back and laughed, one hyena-like bark to the grey sky, and then put the flare gun in his mouth and fired, the last flare igniting and temporarily bathing his head into a halo of magnesium orange and smoke. He tumbled back over the railing. If there was a splash when he hit the water, it was swallowed by the fog. I stood for what seemed like a very long time. It slowly dawned on me that I was alone, the silent audience having melted away below decks, no doubt taking the grim tale with them. I feared for morale, an absurd concern I realized now, but could not move from the spot, as if sheer force of will would cause the sea to regurgitate this man, my friend. The first gunshot broke me from my reverie. In the emergency lockers, I found that a handful of flare guns remained, and I stuffed one into each pocket and entered the dim passageway to a below deck. Over the hollow retort of gunshots, other muffled sounds began to emerge, the choking sobs, the screams of pain and anger, all bringing their faint impression of the copper smell of blood. The dark was oppressive and thick as my heart rose in my chest. The pale, fading light of the chemical glow sticks that hung at regular intervals illuminated the bare corridor, and I moved slowly toward my cabin. It had been sacked, and my service pistol was missing. The next 2 cabins held the corpses of the junior officers, their broken forms still in their bunks, skulls open like blossoming flowers under the point-blank shots. I felt the distinct and irrational desire to run on deck and leap overboard, to swim away from the boat into the unknown sea. I gripped a flare gun and held it out ahead of me, less like a weapon and more like a talisman, and began to pace slowly down the corridor to the enlisted bunks. The door was wide open, and the smell of blood and fear and shit was nauseating. As my eyes slowly adjusted to the dim, I saw a field of bodies torn, shredded, and shattered by bullets and makeshift clubs. A few of the men still moved, twitching slightly. I watched in frozen terror as one man, his face a mask of blood and rage, turned up his head to regard me, and with a weak cry of rage, began to drag himself with his arms, trailing a broken and shattered leg, towards me. From the shadows, another form pounced on him, a boot digging into the wounded man's back with a wet, cracking sound. I recognized the attacker's face in the green chemical din. A quiet and bookish young man, like the captain. This was not the man I knew. This was a beast that wore his skin. He reached down and grabbed the wounded man's jaw, thumb slipping into his mouth. The wounded man growled, a feral, mindless sound, and tried to bite down, but his attacker gripped tight and pulled. The jaw came off with the sound of tearing tendons and an ululating shriek that vanished into the air. I was no longer breathing, holding silently at the entrance, but the attacker snapped his head up to see me, nostrils flaring. The jawbone hit the floor with a meaty sound, and he lunged towards me with silent animal grace. I fired the flare gun, and it hit him square in the chest. His shirt caught fire, and all air escaped his lungs with a sudden forceful exhale, but impossibly, he continued on towards me. As I passed through the portal and slammed the door, the fire had climbed into his hair, and he was squealing now, his clawed hand still outstretched towards me. I felt him impact against the door, and saw that nightmare visage wreathed in fire through the small porthole lips, already burnt away to reveal 2 rows of perfect teeth. He wailed and began to smash his burning form against the door, once, twice, 3 times, and then silence. I raised my eyes to the porthole and saw only the faint image of the burning shape as it disappeared into the darkness. All conscious thought evaporated, and I fled from that charnel house. I have barricaded all entrances to below deck now, and have doomed myself to slow death at the hands of the enveloping cold. I can still hear the living ones down there, screaming and banging on the doors. They are not the men that I knew. I console myself with this thought, as I leave them in the dark to starve or murder each other. If you have read this far and have not fled these waters, or God forbid are still aboard the Mistral, then I beg you again, leave now, while you can. Do not look below deck. There are none of us left to save, and certainly none worth saving. It's cold now, and the fading day surrendering the wan grey light to the dark. There are no stars this night, nothing but the heavy blanket of night. If I could get below, I would find some way of destroying the Mistral, like the brave men of the Magnus Daughter. But it's too late. The most I can make of my last moments, as all feeling flees my extremities and writing becomes impossible, is a warning. Please, send us into the deep. Tell no one you found us and never return. There are things and primal desires older than man, and forces beyond the grasp of our simple minds, and they dwell here, beneath the frozen sea. This story is written by Joseph K. An egg. It was a car accident, nothing particularly remarkable, but fatal nonetheless. You left behind a wife and 2 children. It was a painless death. The EMTs tried their best to save you, but to no avail. Your body was so utterly shattered. You were better off, trust me. And that's when you met me. What happened? You asked. Where am I? You died, I said matter-of-factly. No point mincing words. There was a truck, and it was skidding. Yup, I said. I died. Yup. But don't feel bad about it. Everyone dies, I said. You looked around. There was nothingness, just you and me. What is this place? You asked. Is this the afterlife?
More or less?
I said.
Are you God?
You asked.
Yep,
I replied.
I'm God. My kids. My wife.
You said.
What about them? Will they be alright? That's what I like to see.
I said.
You just died and your main concern is for your family. That's good stuff right there.
You looked at me with fascination. To you, I didn't look like God. I just looked like some man, some vague authority figure, more of a grammar school teacher than the Almighty.
Don't worry,
I said.
They'll be fine. Your kids will remember you as perfect in every way. They didn't have the time to grow contempt for you. Your wife will cry on the outside, but will be secretly relieved. To be fair, your marriage was falling apart. If it's any consolation, she'll feel very guilty for feeling relieved.
Oh. You said.
So what happens now? Do I go to heaven or hell or something? Neither.
I said.
You'll be reincarnated.
Ah. You said.
So the Hindus were right. All the religions are right in their own way.
I said.
Walk with me.
You followed along as we strolled into the void.
Where are we going? Nowhere in particular,
I said.
It's just nice to walk while we talk. So what's the point then?
You asked.
When I get reborn, I'll just be a blank slate, right? A baby. So all my experiences and everything I did in this life won't matter. Not so,
I said.
You have within you all the knowledge and experiences of all your past lives. You just don't remember them right now.
I stopped walking and took you by the shoulders.
Your soul is more magnificent, beautiful, and gigantic than you can possibly imagine. A human mind can only contain a tiny fraction of what you are. It's like sticking your finger in a glass of water to see if it's hot or cold. You put a tiny part of yourself into the vessel, and when you bring it back out, you've gained all the experiences it had. You've been a human for the last 34 years, so you haven't stretched out yet and felt the rest of your immense consciousness. If we hung out here for long enough, you'd start remembering everything, but there's no point doing that between each life.
How many times have I been reincarnated then?
Oh, lots and lots, and into lots of different lives,
I said.
This time around, you'll be a Chinese peasant girl in 540 AD. Wait, what?
You stammered.
You're sending me back in time? Well, I guess technically time as you know it only exists in your universe. Things are different where I come from. Where do you come from?
You pondered.
Oh, sure.
I explained.
I come from somewhere else, and there are others like me. I know you'll want to know what it's like there, but you honestly won't understand.
Oh. You said, a little let down.
But wait, if I get reincarnated to other places in time, could I have interacted with you myself at some point? Sure, happens all the time. And with both lives only aware of their own time span, you don't even know it's happening. So, what's the point of it all? Seriously?
I asked.
Seriously? You're asking me for the meaning of life? Isn't that a little stereotypical? Well, it's a reasonable question.
You persisted. I looked in your eye.
The meaning of life, the reason I made this whole universe, is for you to mature. You mean mankind? You want us to mature? No, just you. I made this whole universe for you. With each new life, you grow and mature and become a larger and greater intellect. Just me. What about everyone else? There is no one else,
I said.
In this universe, there's just you and me.
You stared blankly at me.
But all the people on Earth. All you, different incarnations of you. Wait, I'm everyone. Now you're getting it,
I said with a congratulatory slap on the back.
I'm every human who ever lived.
Or who will ever live, yes.
I'm Abraham Lincoln.
And you're John Wilkes Booth, too,
I added.
I'm Hitler.
You said, appalled.
and you're the millions he killed.
I'm Jesus.
And you're everyone who followed him.
You fell silent.
Every time you victimized someone, I said, you were victimizing yourself. Every act of kindness you've done to yourself. Every happy and sad moment ever experienced by any human was or will be experienced by you.
Why?
You asked me.
Why do all this?
Because someday, you will become like me. Because that's what you are. You're one of my kind. You're my child.
Oh,
You said incredulous.
you mean I'm a god?
No, not yet. You're a fetus. You're still growing. Once you've lived every human life throughout all time, you will have grown enough to be born.
So the whole universe
You said.
is just...
An egg of sorts.
I answered.
Now it's time for you to move on to your next life.
And with that, I sent you on your way. Written by Andy Weir. New York, September 30 CP Flash. Ambassador Hollywell died here today. The end came suddenly as the ambassador was alone in his study. There is something ungodly about these Nightwire jobs. You sit up here on the top floor of a skyscraper and listen into the whispers of a civilization. New York, London, Calcutta, Bombay, Singapore. They are your next-door neighbors after the streetlights go dim and the world has gone to sleep. Alone in the quiet hours between 2 and 4, the receiving operators doze off their sounders and the news comes in. Fires and disasters and suicides, murders, crowds, catastrophes. Sometimes an earthquake with a casualty list as long as your arm. The Nightwire man takes it down almost in his sleep, picking it off in his typewriter with one finger. Once in a long time you prick up your ears and listen. You've heard of someone you knew in Singapore, Halifax or Paris long ago. Maybe they've been promoted, but more probably they've been murdered or drowned. Perhaps they just decided to quit and took some bizarre way out. Made it interesting enough to get in the news. But that doesn't happen often. Most of the time you sit and doze and tap on your typewriter and wish you were home in bed. Sometimes though, one did the other night, and I haven't gotten over it yet. I wish I could. You see, I handle the night manager's desk in a western seaport town. What that name is doesn't matter. There is, or rather was, only one night operator on my staff, a fellow named John Morgan, about 40 years of age I should say, and a sober, hard-working sort. He was one of the best operators I ever knew, what is known as a double man. That means he could handle 2 instruments at once and type the stories on different typewriters at the same time. He was one of the 3 men I ever knew who could do it consistently hour after hour and never make a mistake. Generally, we use only one wire at night, but sometimes, when it was late and the news was coming fast, the Chicago and Denver stations would open a second wire, and then Morgan would do his stuff. He was a wizard. A mechanical, automatic wizard which functioned marvelously but was without imagination. On the night of the 16th, he complained of feeling tired. It was the first and last time I had ever heard him say a word about himself, and I had known him for 3 years. It was just 3 o'clock, and we were running only one wire. I was nodding over the report at my desk and not paying much attention to him when he spoke. Jim, he said, does it feel close in here to you? Why, no, John, I answered, but I'll open a window if you like. Never mind, he said. I reckon I'm just a little tired. That was all that was said, and I went on working. Every 10 minutes or so, I would walk over and take a pile of copy that had stacked up neatly beside the typewriter as the messages were printed out in triplicate. It must have been 20 minutes after he spoke that I noticed he had opened up the other wire and was using both typewriters. I thought it was a little unusual as there was nothing very hot coming in. On my next trip, I picked up the copy from both machines and took it back to my desk to sort out the duplicates. The first wire was running out the usual sort of stuff, and I just looked over it hurriedly. Then I turned to the second pile of copy. I remembered it particularly because the story was from a town I had never heard of. Here is the dispatch. I saved a duplicate of it from our files. Expo September 16 CP Bulletin. The heaviest mist in the history of the city settled over the town at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. All traffic has stopped, and the mist hangs like a pall over everything. Lights of ordinary intensity fail to pierce the fog, which is constantly growing heavier. Scientists here are unable to agree as to the cause, and the local weather bureau states that the like has never occurred before in the history of this city. At 7 p.m. last night, the municipal authorities... More to add. That was all there was. Nothing out of the ordinary at a bureau headquarters, but as I say, I noticed the story because of the name of the town. It must have been 15 minutes later that I went over for another batch of copy. Morgan was slumped down in his chair and had switched his green electric light shade so that the gleam missed his eyes and hit only the top of the two typewriters. Only the usual stuff was in the right-hand pile, but the left-hand batch carried another story from Exhibico. All press dispatches came in takes, meaning that parts of many different stories are strung along together, perhaps with but a few paragraphs of each coming through at a time. This second story was marked Add Fog. Here is the copy. At 7 p.m. the fog had increased noticeably. All lights were now invisible, and the town was shrouded in pitch darkness. As a peculiarity of the phenomenon, the fog is accompanied by a sickly odor, comparable to nothing it experienced here. Below that in customary press fashion was the hour, 3:27, and the initials of the operator, JM. There was only one other story in the pile from the second wire. Here it is. Second, add Exhibico fog. Accounts as to the origin of the mist differ greatly. Among the most unusual is that of the sexton of the local church, who groped his way to the headquarters in a hysterical condition and declared that the fog originated in the village churchyard. It was first visible as a soft grey blanket clinging to the earth above the graves, he stated. Then it began to rise higher and higher. A subterranean breeze seemed to blow it into billows, which split up and then joined together again. Fog phantoms writhing in anguish, twists of the mist into queer forms and figures, and then, in the very thick midst of the mass, something moved. I turned around from the accursed spot. Behind me, I heard screams coming from the houses bordering on the graveyard. Although the sexton's story is generally discredited, a party has left to investigate. Immediately after telling his story, the sexton collapsed and is now in a local hospital unconscious. Queer story, wasn't it? Not that we aren't used to it, for a lot of unusual stories come in over the wire, but for some reason or other, perhaps because it was so quiet that night, the report of the fog made a great impression on me. It was almost with dread that I went over to the waiting piles of copy, and the only sound in the room was the tap-tap of the sounders. It was ominous, nerve-wracking. There was another story from Exhibico in the pile of copy. I seized on it anxiously. New lead, Exhibico Fog CP. The rescue party went out at 11 p.m. to investigate a weird story of the origin of a fog which, since late yesterday, has shrouded the city in darkness, has failed to return. Another and larger party has been dispatched. Meanwhile, the fog has, if possible, grown heavier. It seeps through the cracks in the doors and fills the atmosphere with a depressing odor of decay. It is oppressive, terrifying, bearing with it a subtle impression of things long dead. Residents of the city have left their homes and gathered in the local church, where the priests are holding services of prayer. The scene is beyond description. Grown folk and children are alike terrified, and many are almost beside themselves with fear. Amid the wisps of vapor which partly veil the church auditorium, an old priest is praying for the welfare of his flock. They alternately wail and cross themselves. From the outskirts of the city may be heard cries of unknown voices. They echo through the fog in queer, incandescent minor keys. The sounds resemble nothing so much as the wind whistling through a gigantic tunnel, but the night is calm and there is no wind. The second rescue party... more to come. I am a calm man, and never in a dozen years spent with the wires have I been known to become excited, but despite myself I rose from my chair and walked to the window. Could I be mistaken, or far down in the canyons of the city beneath me did I see a faint trace of fog? Pshaw, it was all imagination. In the press room, the click of the sounders seemed to have raised the tempo of their tune. Morgan alone had not stirred from his chair. His head sunk between his shoulders. He tapped the dispatches out on the typewriters with one finger on each hand. He looked asleep, but no. Endlessly, efficiently, the two machines rattled off line after line as relentlessly and effortlessly as death itself. There was something about the monotonous movement of the typewriter keys that fascinated me. I walked over and stood behind his chair, reading over his shoulder the type as it came into being, word by word. And here was another. Flash, Exipico CP. There will be no more bulletins from this office. The impossible has happened. No messages have come into this room for 20 minutes. We are cut off from the outside and even the streets below us. I will stay with the wire until the end. It is the end, indeed. Since 4 p.m. yesterday, the fog has hung over the city. Following reports from the sexton of the local church, 2 rescue parties were sent out to investigate conditions on the outskirts of the city. Neither party has ever returned, nor was any word received from them. It is quite certain now that they will never return. From my instrument, I can gaze down on the city beneath me. From the position of this room on the 13th floor, nearly the entire city can be seen. Now I can see only a thick blanket of blackness where customarily all lights. Now I can see only a thick blanket of blackness where customarily are lights and life. I fear greatly that the wailing cries heard constantly from the outskirts of the city are the death cries of the inhabitants. They are constantly increasing in volume and are approaching the center of the city. The fog yet hangs over everything. If possible, it is even heavier than before, but the conditions have changed. Instead of an opaque, impenetrable wall of odorous vapor, there now swirls and writhes, a shapeless mass in contortions of almost human agony. Now and again the mass parts, and I catch a brief glimpse of the streets below. People are running to and fro, screaming in despair. A vast bedlam of sound flies up to my window, and above all this the immense whistling of unseen and unfelt winds. The fog has again swept over the city, and the whistling is coming closer and closer. It is now directly beneath me. God! An instant ago the mist opened, and I caught a glimpse of the streets below. The fog is not simply vapor. It lives. By the side of each moaning and weeping human is a companion figure, an aura of strange and vari-colored hues. How the shapes cling, each to a living thing. The man and women are down, flat on their faces. The fog figures caress them lovingly. They are kneeling beside them. They are... but I dare not tell it. The prone and writhing bodies have been stripped of their clothing. They are being consumed. Piecemeal. A merciful wall of hot, steaming vapor has swept over the whole scene. I can see no more. Beneath me, the wall of vapor is changing colors. It seems to be lighted by eternal fires. No, it isn't. I've made a mistake. The colors are from above. Reflections from the sky. Look up! Look up! The whole sky is in flames. Colors as yet unseen by man or demon. The flames are moving. They have started to intermix. The colors are rearranging themselves. They are so brilliant that my eyes burn. They are a long way off. Now, they have begun to swirl, to circle in and out, twisting in intricate designs and patterns. The lights are racing each with each, a kaleidoscope of unearthly brilliance. I have made a discovery. There is nothing harmful in the lights. They radiate force and friendliness, almost cheeriness, but by their very strength, they hurt. As I look, they are swinging closer and closer, a million miles at each jump, millions of miles, with the speed of light. Aye, it is light of quintessence of all light. Beneath it, the fog melts into a jeweled mist, radiant, rainbow colors of 1,000 varied spectra. I can see the streets. Why, they are filled with people. The lights are coming closer. They are all around me. I am enveloped. The message stopped abruptly. The wire to Exhibico was dead. Beneath my eyes, in the narrow circle of light, from under the green lampshade, the black printing no longer spun itself, letter by letter, across the page. The room seemed filled with a solemn quiet, a silence vaguely impressive, powerful. I looked down at Morgan. His hands had dropped nervelessly at his sides, while his body had hunched over peculiarly. I turned the lampshade back, throwing light squarely in his face. His eyes were staring, fixed, filled with a sudden foreboding. I stepped beside him and called Chicago on the wire. After a second, the sound clicked its answer. But there was something wrong. Chicago was reporting that wire 2 had not been used throughout the evening. "Morgan!" I shouted. "Morgan, wake up! It isn't true! Someone has been hoaxing us, why?" In my eagerness, I grasped him by the shoulder. His body was quite cold. Morgan had been dead for hours. Could it be that his sensitized brain and automatic fingers had continued to record impressions even after the end? I shall never know, for I shall never again handle the night shift. Search in a world atlas discloses no towns of Exhibico. Whatever it was that killed John Morgan will forever remain a mystery. Written by H.F. Arnold in 1926, titled The Nightwire. Listeners, I hope you enjoyed all 3 tales. There was so much fun to narrate, and landing 2 tales about fog. Talk about a coincidence of kinds. Now listeners, if you have stories of your own or want to recommend me some tales to narrate, be sure to reach out to me via my email, storiesfablesghostlytales@gmail.com. And if you have any spare time on your hands, leave an iTunes review so marvelous people like you can also find this show. Now, I want to thank the magical people that keep this show growing and improving, my Patreon supporters. Megastar Maya, aka Queen of the Feline and Pleaser of Fantastic Furballs. Maya, I don't say this enough, but you are epic in your level of support. 3 times a week, mate, and I still ain't seen enough. I've used your support today to fund my RX software upgrade and boosted my access to Neutron 3, which all allows me to master my audio in very different ways. I'm also getting used to using different software and following all these different kinds of tutorials, so if the sound is a little different these days, that'll be why. I've also renewed my access to SoundCrate, which means even more special effects. Thank you so much, Maya. You really are a godsend and a legend to me and the show. You're bloody marvelous. My first white tea warlord, Les Bauer. Mate, thank you for your support. I purchased a new set of music, which you've heard today actually, thanks to your support, and a set of tools to also streamline my workflow when it comes to editing. Tools that let me alter sound effects and master the audio in the middle of lengthy takes. Thanks, mate, for being brilliant and supporting me in this way. I'm able to achieve cleaner audio from each and every episode now. Thank you so much, man. The Crystal Maiden, Paige Kramer. Paige, you're awesome. Thank you for being you and supporting the show as you do. I've been putting your funds aside for subscription costs and covering expenses with the website, whilst also putting it towards the new software I use. I'm so grateful for your support, mate, and not a dime is wasted on how it's used for this show. Thank you, Paige. You're marvelous. And my brilliant Earl Grey enforcers I am so lucky to have. Just Heather, Juicebox Andy, Peter Raffaelli, Dolphin and Cow, Michelangelo Yacone, Divided by Zero, and Leah Fassig. Have an epic weekend, mates. Stay safe, stay awesome. That last one is super easy for you lot. And I'll catch you next Monday for more remastered old time radio. As always, my lovelies, till next we meet.